What Kody Brown just revealed shocked even longtime Sister Wives fans, because after decades inside a secretive plural marriage, she is finally exposing the truth about rejection, faith, and the moment everything broke apart. And trust me, the story gets even more unbelievable as it goes on. So before we dive in, make sure you subscribe right now, because on this channel, we uncover the stories reality TV never fully tells. A few months ago, something happened that quietly shook the entire Sister Wives community, because Christine Woolley sat down for a podcast interview that many people expected to be just another casual conversation, but instead it turned into one of the most revealing moments in the history of the Brown family story. And the surprising part is that it did not happen on television or during a dramatic reunion episode, but on a podcast whose title alone feels almost shocking for someone raised in a strict religious environment. The podcast was called Death, Sex, and Money. And the moment you hear that title, you already know this is not going to be a soft, surface-level conversation, because those three subjects are exactly the things that most conservative religious communities rarely speak about openly. Yet here was Christine, someone who had spent decades living inside a very structured faith, suddenly talking honestly about her life, her choices, and the reality behind the world millions of people had only seen through edited television episodes. And from the very beginning of the interview, there was a sense that Christine was finally speaking from a place of freedom rather than obligation, because for the first time in many years, she was no longer trying to protect the image of a family structure she had already walked away from. And as she began telling her story, it quickly became clear that the real beginning of her journey did not start with television fame or public attention, but many years earlier, when she was just a young woman trying to understand her faith, her identity, and her place in a complicated spiritual tradition. And the moment that changed everything for her came when her own mother made a decision that shocked their family. Her mother chose to leave the church and also leave plural marriage, which for many people in that community would have felt like walking away from the entire foundation of life itself. And for Christine, who was still very young, that moment created a crossroads. She could have followed the same path as her mother and stepped away from the beliefs she had grown up with, but instead she did something unexpected. She moved in the opposite direction with even more determination than before. At only 19 years old, she decided she would fully commit to the principle of plural marriage, not because someone forced her, but because she believed she had personally received confirmation through prayer and reflection that this was the life she was meant to live. She described spending long periods praying and searching for guidance until she felt a calm certainty that plural marriage was her spiritual path. And at the same time, there was someone already in her life who would soon become central to that journey: Kody Brown. At that stage, he was simply part of the same social world, a friend, someone she knew through their religious community. But as Christine strengthened her commitment to faith, she also began transforming her lifestyle to match the standards she believed were expected of a devoted believer. She removed music that did not match her values, stopped watching films that were not considered appropriate, changed the way she dressed, and began preparing herself to wear the sacred religious garments that represented commitment to her faith. She even joked later that during that period, she became almost intensely devoted to doing everything exactly right, as if she had earned a gold star for being the most dedicated follower she could possibly be. And within that strong sense of devotion, Christine formed a very specific dream about how she wanted her future family to look. She did not just want to live plural marriage, she had already decided that she wanted to be the third wife. And the reasoning behind that decision reveals a lot about how she imagined the structure of plural families at the time. Because in her young mind, the first wife seemed to carry too much responsibility. The first wife had to build the foundation of the family, establish routines, create traditions, and handle the early challenges of adjusting to a shared marriage. The second wife, in her mind, faced another difficult position because she might feel like she was interrupting an already established relationship and could be viewed as a source of tension. But the third wife seemed perfect because by the time she joined the family, the first two wives would have already worked through the difficult adjustments, the systems would already exist, and the family would already know how to function together. In that scenario, she imagined herself simply stepping into an environment where everything was organized, harmonious, and stable. But as Christine would later laugh about during the interview, that vision was incredibly naive, because real families do not work like systems that remain unchanged every time a new person joins the household. Everything shifts. Personalities, expectations, and emotions all move in new directions, and when she finally became the third wife, she quickly learned that there was no such thing as simply sliding into an already functioning structure, because every individual brings new needs, new perspectives, and new challenges that must be understood by everyone else. And in those early years of marriage, the family dynamic became even more complicated because the wives were all becoming mothers around the same time, which meant they were learning how to raise children while also learning how to share a husband and maintain relationships with each other within the same home. The first child in the family, Logan, was born only 2 months after Christine married into the family, which meant the transition into motherhood and plural marriage happened almost simultaneously. And suddenly, 3 women were navigating the responsibilities of parenting while trying to respect each other's boundaries and parenting styles. And although they lived together and considered the children part of one extended family, each mother still held the primary authority for her own children, which meant decisions about discipline, routines, and expectations could become complicated discussions because every adult in the house grew up with different rules and different ideas about how children should be raised. One mother might believe discipline should be strict, another might believe children learn best through patience and guidance, while another might prefer a more relaxed approach. And even simple questions like whether children should jump on furniture or how they should behave during meals required conversations that balanced respect, understanding, and compromise. And while the outside world sometimes imagined plural marriage as a perfectly coordinated community within a single household, the reality inside the home required constant emotional energy. Because every decision had the potential to affect several relationships at once. And on top of those challenges, there was also the issue of secrecy, because during those years, the family lived in places where plural marriage could bring legal and social consequences, which meant Christine often had to decide carefully who could know the truth about her family and who could not. Sometimes she would become close to coworkers and eventually share the truth, only to discover that people around her already suspected or already knew, especially in small communities where word travels quickly. And even though many people treated her kindly, the experience of living between private reality and public secrecy was always present. And then, in 2010, the family stepped into an entirely new world when the television series Sister Wives premiered. Suddenly, the life they had spent years protecting became visible to millions of viewers across the country. But what many viewers did not realize was that filming the show brought a unique challenge that the family had never faced before. Because after each moment was filmed, the producers would ask them to sit down individually and talk about what had just happened. They had to explain their feelings, describe their reactions, and reflect on conflicts that previously might have been ignored or quietly resolved within the privacy of the home. And that process forced conversations that might never have happened otherwise, sometimes bringing clarity and sometimes bringing tension, because speaking openly about emotions can reveal truths that people may not be ready to face. And for Christine, those interview moments often felt like sitting under a spotlight, where hidden feelings became impossible to ignore. Because when the cameras focused on her alone and questions were asked about jealousy, hurt, or disappointment, she sometimes realized that emotions she thought she had successfully hidden were actually visible to everyone watching. And over time, those moments helped her recognize patterns within her marriage that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Because although she still believed deeply in the spiritual principles she had chosen as a young woman, she could not avoid noticing the differences in how attention, affection, and emotional support were distributed within the family. And the most painful part was not simply feeling overlooked, but the quiet question that began repeating itself in her mind. Why could she not receive the same level of connection that she sometimes saw elsewhere? And that question slowly began affecting the way she viewed herself, because instead of questioning the structure around her, she often assumed the problem must be something about her. Maybe she was not devoted enough, maybe she was not patient enough, Maybe she was not worthy enough of the kind of relationship she had hoped to experience. And that internal struggle continued for years, quietly shaping her thoughts, even while she continued fulfilling her role within the family, raising children, supporting the household, and trying to maintain harmony. And from the outside, the family continued appearing functional, even successful through the lens of television. But inside Christine's heart, a very different story was slowly unfolding, one that would eventually lead her to question not only her marriage, but the entire path she had once believed was her destiny. And that realization was only the beginning of a much larger journey that would ultimately change the direction of her life forever. As the years continued to pass, Christine slowly began noticing that the small feelings she once pushed aside were becoming impossible to ignore, because living in a plural marriage required constant emotional balance. Yet the balance often depended on whether everyone involved felt valued, respected, and heard. And when that sense of balance begins to disappear, even the strongest faith can struggle to hold everything together. And Christine began recognizing that what hurt her the most was not simply the complicated structure of plural marriage, but the quiet feeling of rejection that appeared again and again in moments that seemed small to others, yet deeply meaningful to her. She explained that rejection feels different from ordinary disappointment because it carries the message that you are somehow less important than someone else. And over time, those experiences began shaping the way she saw herself. She started asking difficult questions in private, wondering why she could see her husband being attentive, thoughtful, and affectionate in other relationships, while her own connection often felt distant or strained. And the painful part was not just witnessing those differences, but feeling that she must somehow be the reason for them. Because when someone grows up believing that their spiritual destiny depends on making a marriage work, it becomes very easy to assume that any struggle must be a personal failure. And for a long time, Christine carried that belief quietly, convincing herself that if she tried harder, showed more patience, or gave more support, everything might eventually improve. Yet the emotional weight continued building, because plural marriage created a unique challenge when serious conversations needed to happen. In a monogamous relationship, two people must eventually face a conflict together until it is resolved. But in a plural marriage, the dynamic can become very different, because when tension rises, one partner may leave the conversation and spend time in another household, which means the difficult discussion never truly finishes. It simply pauses until the next visit. And by the time that visit arrives, the atmosphere has changed. The desire to reopen a painful topic has faded, and daily responsibilities take priority. And this cycle can repeat many times, leaving important emotions unspoken and unresolved. And Christine described how that pattern slowly created a feeling that she was never able to complete the conversations that mattered most. The issues would appear again and again, but the chance to fully understand them or heal them never seemed to arrive. And during the same period, something interesting was happening through the reality show, because the interview segments required each person to speak openly about their experiences, sometimes alone, with only a camera and a producer asking questions. And in those quiet moments, Christine began expressing thoughts that she had never spoken aloud before, because the environment felt strangely safe, almost like a private confession, where she could finally say the things she had been holding inside for years. Yet even that honesty created new complications, because once a feeling is spoken aloud, it becomes harder to ignore. And she began realizing that the emotions she was describing were not temporary frustrations, but deeper concerns about respect, partnership, and the kind of marriage she truly wanted. And one of the moments that helped trigger a deeper shift in her thinking began with something that seemed incredibly simple: earrings. Early in her marriage, Kody had once mentioned that he did not like earrings, so Christine removed hers, believing that honoring his preference was a natural part of being supportive. But years later, when another wife started a jewelry business, the family began promoting earrings again as a way to support the project. And Christine assumed she could occasionally participate, until she learned that the restriction was actually connected to a religious leader who discouraged women from wearing earrings. And that discovery surprised her, because she realized she had been following a rule she never fully understood. And in that moment, something changed. She went to Kody and calmly explained that she would begin wearing earrings again, and his response was unexpectedly casual. He simply said, "Okay." And that small interaction opened a new door in her mind, because she began wondering how many other choices in her life had been shaped by traditions, expectations, or interpretations that she had accepted without question. And that curiosity soon expanded to include the sacred garments she had worn faithfully for years, garments that once represented devotion and comfort, but now felt connected to a larger system that influenced how women saw themselves within their faith and family. Christine explained that she once loved wearing those garments and found meaning in them, yet once she began viewing them through the lens of control, the emotional connection changed, and eventually she chose to stop wearing them. When Kody noticed, he asked her directly about the decision, and she answered honestly, explaining that she no longer believed those expectations defined her relationship with God or her worth as a person. His response was not anger, but curiosity, asking how her faith felt without them, and she replied simply that her relationship with God was still strong. And that answer reflects the complicated space she was living in during that time, because she had not completely abandoned her spiritual beliefs. She was simply re-evaluating which parts of those beliefs truly belonged to her and which parts had been inherited from the community around her. And maintaining that balance required tremendous emotional effort, because she was still living the life of a plural wife, raising children, supporting the family, and participating in daily routines while internally questioning ideas that once felt permanent. Eventually, that tension reached a point where her body seemed to understand the truth before her mind was ready to admit it. She described experiencing a moment she called a primal scream, a powerful emotional release that arrived after years of holding everything together. And in that moment, she realized she could not continue living the same life the way she had before. Completely new story. And if there is one quiet message hidden throughout everything she shared, it is that courage often grows slowly through small realizations until one day you look around and realize the life you once feared leaving behind was only preparing you for the life you were meant to create next. And that is the journey that changed everything for Christine, proving that sometimes the bravest choice is walking away to build a better life. And if this story opened your eyes, make sure you hit subscribe right now, because this channel brings you the